Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to be talking about how to harmonise an ascending scale when the scale occurs in the bass, but how to have something in one of the upper voices at least that's going to just elaborate what could be a rather pedestrian pattern otherwise. This is one of the dangers we have when we want to put an ascending scale, particularly when it's in a bass line, and then we're thinking, but what do we write above that scale that makes it sound interesting? So I'm sure if we think about a scale of C major, this will be familiar to most people. Now, what can we do? Well, we can come up with some chords. We could go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, back to 1. Not going to be particularly satisfactory, that, because it's absolutely loaded with what we call consecutives or parallels. We're going along in fifths from one chord to the next, and we'll probably be going along in octaves as well. So not so clever to think about doing it that way. And also, what are you going to do with a melody or any upper part that's just going absolutely in step with the bass? It works very nicely actually to have one part that's running parallel with the bass when you have an ascending scale, but it doesn't work if that part is running in octaves or in fifths. So really, usually it ends up running in thirds. So you can see what I've got here. I've got my ascending scale in the bass there, and I've got one of my upper parts running in parallel with the bass, just in thirds. So we start with the bass, and then we say one of our upper parts can run in thirds with that. An octave and a third gives us what we know as a tenth, and it actually is a very pleasant sounding kind of combination, pleasant texture. So when you're harmonizing a bass anyway, having an upper part that runs in thirds or sixths with the bass is often a pretty satisfactory thing to do. Once you've kind of done that, it helps you kind of alight on what your chords might be. Because if I've got on the first note of the scale, I've got C, if I put E with it, well, I've got C and E. There are only two chords really that are going to fit that, because C and E are the root and the third of a chord 1, a C major chord. They're also the third and the fifth of an A minor chord, a chord 6. So I'm either going to harmonize that with chord 1 or with chord 6. Now, if you're trying to harmonize a scale of C major and you're kind of trying to be firm about the tonality of C major, you're probably going to go for a chord 1 at the beginning. So that kind of helps you when you're running these thirds above the bass to start thinking, yeah, actually, I'm going to want to have this as a chord 1 rather than a chord 6. Okay, well, if I go on to the next chord and I've got D and A, well, this could mean D and F. So D and F could associate with A and give me a chord 2. But if I go 1, 2, I'm going root position, everybody moving in the same direction like this. And that's when I end up with my octaves and my fifths. So it's not such a clever idea. So if I've got D and F, well, they could be the root and the third of this D minor chord, this chord 2, but they could also be the third and the fifth of this B diminished chord, chord 7. So you might be thinking, chord 7. And you might even have read somewhere that 7 is the kind of least important chord in the hierarchy. That's generally speaking true. You might also have read that chord 7 in root position is not a good idea. That's mainly because of this rather exposed tritone. But you might also have read that if you're going to use 7, try to use it in first inversion. Now, thankfully for us, because we've got D in the bass, we do end up using chord 7 in first inversion if we're not going to use the chord 2. So you're beginning to see how we're arriving at this choice of chords that really comes out of writing thirds between one part and the bass. We move on to the next chord. Well, what have we got now? We've got E in the bass and we've got G. So put those together. Well, that could be something to do with an E minor chord or a chord 3, or it might be something to do with a C major chord, a chord 1, because E and G that we've already got are the root and the third of E minor or chord 3. They're the third and the fifth of chord 1, C major. And because we've got E in the bass, well, it's going to be chord 1 in first inversion. So you might know that as a 1B, or you might know it as a 1/6. So we're beginning to kind of piece together, possibilities for this, aren't we? Now, once you get into first inversion chords, they're quite useful. I wrote the wrong thing there, didn't I? That should be a 7B. Sorry about that. Once we get into that, we can then begin to see, what's going to kind of go on now as we kind of climb up this scale. We're going to continue the same kind of thinking. We're probably going to end up with 2B or 2/6, 3B or 3/6, 4B or 4/6, 5B or 5/6, and then we'll kind of finish off by coming back to 1 again. So you see, these first inversion chords are really helpful. If you roll out a whole series of root position chords when we're all going in the same direction, you are going to have a load of parallels or consecutives, these fifths and these octaves. If you run a series of first inversion chords, actually, that's using a 6 above the bass note and a third above the bass note. Now, if you run in parallel thirds and sixths, actually, that's okay. So I can kind of get going and then do a whole load of first inversion chords and then finish on the tonic. Actually works out quite well. Okay, so this is better than going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1. When I'm going 1, 7 first inversion, 1 first inversion, 2 first inversion, 3 first inversion, 4 first inversion, 5 first inversion, 1. So that's helping us with the chords. Except that it's still sounding, well, it's a little bit dull, isn't it? Everybody just hopping up the bus together like that. Well, this is where this bit comes in. Chains of 7/6 suspensions. So let's see what this is all about. Well, a suspension has 3 parts. In a suspension, you prepare, sound, resolve. PSR. And this happens over 2 chords. Now you might think that's strange because PSR sounds like 3 things, but you've only got 2 chords. Well, one chord fits with P and the second chord fits with R, and S is a kind of dissonant note that happens with the R chord but doesn't quite fit it. But the note you use for P is the same as the note you use for S, so you either repeat it or sustain it. And when you go from S to R, you go by step normally downwards. So you have to have these 3 things, P, S, R. Let's have a look at how this works out in this piece. Well, this is a P note, all right, because it fits with the chord 1. And then I'm sustaining it when the next chord moves. So you can see on the 3rd beat, the chord moves and I've still got the same note. So this note is now S, even though C clashes with the 7 in first inversion, but quickly moves down to B. So it's moving by step. I say usually downwards, it does in this case. So that R note fits with the chord. So P fits with the first chord, R fits with the second chord, S is sounding with the second chord, but is dissonant with the second chord, but it resolves by step downwards. Same note for P as S, then go downwards to resolve to R. Okay, now I've got P, S, R, and then I kind of carry on doing the same thing. So I go P, S, R, then I go P, S, R, and so on through the whole thing. Why is it called a 7/6? Well, when S goes to R, we kind of notate that above the bass. So I've got D in the bass, C is a 7th above D, and it's moving to 6 above D. So we call this a 7/6. So your 7/6 is talking about S going to R, doesn't talk about P at all. And then I've got 7/6. You see what's happening? I'm doing a 7/6 on each note of the bass. And this just elaborates the chord scheme that we previously described, make it a bit more interesting. When you write a suspension as well, the suspended note just adds a little bit of intensity to the moment. And then when it moves on to R, you think, it's resolved. It kind of relaxes it a bit. So it's an interesting series of little tensions, little releases, just to make it more interesting than just doing the plain chords. So let me now play what I've got notated here. It's going to sound like this. Now, do you see and hear that that is a vast improvement on just the chords going 1, 7B, 1B, 2B, 3B, 4B, 5B, 1. And all underpinned by those thirds running in the other parts. Well, that's one way of doing it, but if I were to take the same thing and turn the upper parts upside down, in order to do that, I'm sort of keeping this part at pitch and I'm taking this part as that part an octave lower. So you see how that works. For people who are used to suspensions, you might think, oh, the 7's moving to the 6 quite quickly. We're not going 7 on one beat, 6 on the next beat. We're going 7 on the beat, 6 on the next half beat. Perfectly possible to do that. So it's a way of kind of condensing suspensions a little bit. But I'm hoping you can hear that that gives you a very nice sequence. So we have this ascending bass line. We've got chords that fit, that are not giving us the parallels. And then we've got one of the upper parts at least doing something quite interesting. And you can elaborate any of the other parts as well, perhaps make them a little bit conversational with that moving part that we've described, but it just gives you an interesting way of harmonizing an ascending scale that happens to be in the bass, using chords that don't create trouble for you, and doing something that makes it melodically rather more interesting. And chains of 7/6 suspensions, that's when you have a 7/6 suspension and you immediately put another one in and then another one and then another one. So you link them together by making a chain of them. So there we are. I hope that's a useful little technique to add to your armory of harmonization. Well, if you've enjoyed this video, let me invite you to pay a little visit to the Music Matters website, www.mmcourses.co.uk. Lots of courses on there, as well as information about our Maestro's global musical community. If you're the kind of musician who likes to kind of do things by ear, you want to be able to hear things and then write them down, or maybe you're in that slightly frustrating place where you've got lots of things, ideas in your head, but you're not quite sure how to notate them. Let me point you to one course in particular. It's our aural dictation course, which sort of sounds rather academic, but the course kind of takes you on a journey that enables you to hear sounds in your head and to write them down. It's also going to empower you as a sight reader because it will enable you to look at music and hear what it sounds like just looking at the page. So it's an incredibly kind of liberating thing to be able to do. That's the aural dictation course. So just click on courses on the homepage, find the aural dictation course, and you'll be there. Lots of other courses to look at while you're on. www.mmcourses.co.uk.